These are the notes for Chapter 9. This is the first set of notes, which will go over some of the genetics vocabulary you will need for the rest of the chapter. Through this presentation, you will be able to identify the genotype and phenotype, distinguish between dominant and recessive alleles, and explain the idea of true breeding in terms of genotype and phenotype. The definition of genetics is fairly simple, and I'm sure you have a good idea of what it is anyway. But here we go. It's the science or the study of heredity. Well, let's jump down and look at heredity. It's simply the passing of genetic traits from parent to offspring. So genetics is studying how these genetic traits are passed from parent to offspring. Many biology books include our last section of meiosis in with the genetics chapter, because meiosis really is how our genetic traits are passed from parent to offspring. A quick review of genes. Here are the chromosomes we studied in our last chapter. We know that the chromosomes are made up of tightly coiled DNA. Well, each section on the DNA codes for a specific protein or other macromolecule. That is a gene. Characteristics versus traits. I know in your mind you may be thinking that they're the same thing. However, your book makes an effort to distinguish between the two. So we're going to go over that here. A characteristic is a feature or quality that's used to identify someone or a place. Imagine that you're trying to describe a friend to your parents who will pick them up at a crowded parking lot. You may describe things such as your friend's hair color. Maybe it's blue. You'll describe whether they're a boy or a girl. Are they tall? Are they short? Are they thin? Are they a little on the heavy side? These are all characteristics of that person. Now, a trait is a little bit different. A trait is a genetically determined characteristic. So while you may describe that your friend has blue hair, that's not really a trait. The trait would be whatever their hair color is underneath the blue. All of this to say, your book makes an effort to distinguish between these two. And then, later in the chapter, it treats them as synonyms. So in our class, whenever you hear characteristic or trait, you can think of a feature of a person that is either genetically determined or not. Either way, we'll get through this, but treat them as synonyms. Phenotype and genotype are not synonyms. Hopefully, looking at the prefixes, while you may have no idea about pheno, geno hopefully reminds you of genes. So your genotype is actually the collection of all of your genes that make you who you are. The prefix pheno you can associate with phenomenal. It's how you look. And most days you guys look phenomenal. So that's phenotype, what you actually look like. Your genotype are the actual genes you inherited from your parents. Remember, your genotype codes for your phenotype. The genes that you received from your parents determine what you look like. Now, let's take this idea of genotype and phenotype and talk about true breeding. A note here, true breeding specifically refers to plants. The reason why we're talking about it now is so that we can talk about Mendel's true breeding pea plants. In plants, true breeding means that a plant that self-pollinates, it has a certain set of genes. All of its offspring will have the exact same phenotype. The closest thing to true breeding in the animal world are true-bred animals. Well, scratch that. Are purebred animals. Think about purebred dogs or purebred horses. If you have a Shar-Pei puppy, you know that the only way to know if it's a purebred is to look at the parents. Are the parents purebred Shar-Peis as well? Now, a little bit more vocabulary. You know what dominant and recessive mean. You have something that is dominant over something else. Well, that something is called an allele. In the past, you may have called it a gene or a trait, but the proper name is, in fact, allele. Look at the example. Eye color is the characteristic. The trait would be brown, blue, green, or hazel. Now, you get one trait from your parent and one trait from the other parent. Instead of saying trait, we're going to use the term allele. You got one allele for eye color from your parent, from your mom, and one allele for eye color from your dad. Which one is expressed in your phenotype depends on if the allele is dominant or recessive. I'm going to take a moment here and tell you that many of the things you've heard throughout your academic career are not quite right. There are very few traits that are actually dominant or actually recessive in humans. Most of our traits are considered polygenic, meaning more than one gene. In fact, we now know that eye color is made up of as many as 15 different genes. So trying to track pure dominant and recessive just by looking at the eye color of your siblings and your parents may not actually work. I have a list of some human traits that are purely dominant or recessive, with the exception of number 1 and number 3 here. It says they're probably polygenic, meaning we're not quite sure yet, but we think it may be controlled by more than one gene. You can pause the video to take a look at these different items. And that's all for this set.